I'd like to thank Columbia and Barnard for inviting me, and also to mention, as Beck did, the Neurogenderings group. A lot of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes have really come from that group and probably belong more to that group than they do to me, so I'd like to acknowledge their contribution. As Beck said, I work in the I have to say Birmingham, because even in England people don't seem to know where Aston is, so I will say Birmingham. That's our building there, and we have all this cool kit. Beck did say to make the talk heavy on visuals, so hopefully, given the amount of, what I'm going to be talking about is the blink of an eye, really, or a moment in time in brain imaging. So I'm hoping the pictures will do, and that you'll ask questions afterwards. So I have this cool kit. I have EEG, the original sort of brain imaging. We also have fMRI that people will be familiar with, and we also have a more unusual system, MEG, or magnetoencephalography. And what I can actually do is produce these wonderful images which show all sorts of different types of activity. You can get just a structure, you can get pathways, you can find out where things are happening in the brain, or on the surface of the brain. So we do have these fantastic images which you'd think should be part of the solution to understanding any kind of issue to do with the brain, particularly with structures of the brain, but also if you're interested in links between brain and behaviour. But as I will briefly, hopefully, show, sometimes these pictures are part of the problem and not part of the solution. So whizzing back in time, people have been interested in the study of the brain for as long as they've been interested in the study of science, the study of the body itself. They've been interested in how it's always a kind of, I don't know if this has anything to do with it being male scientists, it also seems to be a size matters issue. So the bigger the brain, the brighter, the cleverer, the more intelligent the person. So there was a lot of early work before you could actually look at the brain, taking skulls, filling with ball bearings, weighing the ball bearings and saying the bigger the skull, the brighter the person. Even then, slight anxiety, they discovered that some women's skulls clearly contained bigger brains, so they had to rethink the algorithms of it there. Also, the idea that you could map different functions of behaviour, different characteristics of people onto the surface of the brain, in this case onto the surface of an individual here, and again, size mattered. The bigger your intelligence bump on your head, the brighter you were, etc. So very early on, interest in brain, size mattered, etc. The link with the brain itself and its manifestations as part of the mind, and I say this with some hesitation, knowing that there will be philosophers in the room, is something which is actually not as old as the study of the brain. But even way back in the 17th century, with the newly emerging science of anatomy, a philosopher called François Poulain de la Barre came up with this wonderful statement which actually would do away with a lot of the jobs and studies that people in this room are currently employed with. The mind has no sex. He looked at all the various parts of the anatomy which appeared to be associated with the sorts of behaviour that might be an indication of the mind at work, and said there was actually no differences between males and females that he could find, and that females, given the right opportunity, could well succeed as well as men. So hurrah for de la Barre. So the mind has no sex. But unfortunately, we fast forward to the 18th and 19th century, and mind has no sex. Oh, yes, it does. A lot of scientists were spending a lot of time, in very strange ways, studying different aspects of male and female brains, starting, as was the case, from the idea, the political social status quo. Women are inferior, so what we brain scientists have to do is explain this inferiority. So they suggested that women were inferior forms of human evolution. Bright women were as rare as a gorilla with two heads, which is an image you might like to ponder on at some point. And all of the work they were doing was focused on trying to prove this inferiority. Okay, whiz right back to the current day, these wonderful images that the people I work with and people in this room can produce, surely this would be part of the solution. Surely we can say, now we really understand how the brain works, we can ask the right questions, we have access to millisecond insights into what's going on. But it would appear that this isn't the case, and this is what the rest of my very short time now is going to be about. So, out with the old, in with the new. Are we really interested in are we asking different questions? And this is something that Vanessa sort of touched on. Actually, no. We're still fixated with size. There's still people saying, we've managed to find that the corpus callosum there is a difference between males and females, different ratios of grey and white matter between males and females, different parts of the limbic system. The question is always being asked. We have access to the brains. Let's see where we can find differences. And the term difference, which we'll discuss more, implied that all men were like this, bigger corpus callosum part of, or women were like this, different grey matter ratios, etc. That in itself is not true. And just as a passing observation, a lot of the populist books that I'll touch on briefly are very keen on these differences and reporting them. And more recently, it's been shown that in fact what we say is size matters. If you actually take the size and the volume of the brain into account, then all of these differences disappear. But we're still asking those old questions. The other thing we're saying, well, we're getting away from phrenology, surely. We're no longer looking at the way in which different size bumps inform how good you are at different tasks. Well, actually, slightly different version, but that's exactly what early brain images and current brain images are still doing. Drawing these wonderful maps saying different parts of the brain do different things. This is your logical, scientific brain on the left-hand side. This is your emotional, creative brain on the right-hand side. And these are associated with male-female differences as well. Similarly, mapping different sorts of activation patterns. This is a map of males undergoing, doing a linguistic task, nice focused part of the brain activated there, in fact on the left in that particular orientation, whereas females are associated with bilateral activation. That paper, incidentally, has been cited over 1,500 times by neuroscientists themselves and by populist press that we'll come on to, and is actually been shown not to be replicable, to be wrong, but is still of the basis of the kind of thing we're thinking of. Okay, so moving again swiftly on. So we're still asking the same questions, but how are we communicating the answers, and are there problems there? And that is indeed the case, and I briefly will summarise it as something I'll call neurononsense, which we'll talk a bit more about. Two types of neurononsense, neurotrash and neurosexism. So what do I mean by those? Well, first of all, neurotrash is really to do with misunderstanding what neuroscientists are doing. In the UK, a lot of journalists, even science journalists, are actually arts graduates, and unlike the wonderfully liberal US system, it means that they've probably given up science at the age of 14. So we've got lots of people describing really high-level scientific stuff who really don't have much understanding of what's going on. So it's possibly not their fault, but it's the kind of illusions that we come across. For example, that what we're looking at here, these are images from my lab which look wonderful, and it's the illusion that I'm reading somebody's mind, that this is in real time, that it's almost as if I peeled back the skull, I'd be able to see the brain like this. And we ourselves talk about the brain lighting up. Also the idea that we're somehow mapping different functions. We're drawing up a dictionary or an atlas of the brain so that somebody sees some brain activity, quickly looks it up in their A to Z and says, oh, that person's thinking about, I wonder how long that person is going to carry on talking because I really need to go and do something else, for example. There are problems. This is something which people may be aware of. In order to demonstrate the fact that, and this Hannah's talk may touch on this, we do a lot of smoothing, correcting, normalising, etc. with our data. Very quick to collect in real time, in fact, but we have to do a lot of statistical manipulation, not in a significant way, but it does mean that there is a bit of a disconnect between what you're seeing in real time and what you're seeing in other time. Beck's given me the 9 minutes, so I'll have to race on. So this is something that has become very famous in that somebody showed that if you put a dead salmon in a scanner, showed it happy and sad faces, carried out all the particular techniques you need to use, you can in fact find, you can see it very clearly here, there is a centre in the dead salmon's brain which is sensitive to happy and sad faces. The dead salmon that launched 1,000 skeptics. I will go through this really quickly because Beck's given me the wave. The other
a little bit of leeway.
A little bit, okay. But the other illusion is that we've got this idea that I could look at those images and say, I know exactly what's going on. I've shown this slide to rooms full of neuroscientists saying, could you tell what this person is doing by looking at these patterns of activation? They might say, the amygdala's active, insular a bit active, just checking on the age range in this. People say, I know what. You've had people having sex in the scanner, which is a whole different version of what's going on. Or they're at least thinking about sex in the scanner. In fact, what this is an image of somebody eating chocolate. So quite a nice synergy there for the neuromarketers, possibly. Okay, so these are the kind of books that emerge from misunderstanding. Won't go into those in detail, but anyway, I call them neurotrash. The other problem we have is something which is called neurosexism, and that's where the neuroscientists themselves seem to be basing their interpretation, as Vanessa has said, on some kind of stereotypical pattern of activity that they need to prove. Now, there's 2 studies here from the same lab. They have been publicly dissed, as it were, so I'm not hopefully opening Columbia up to being sued. This was a study looking at wiring differences in the brain, reported as being hugely different, fundamental sex differences in the brain. What these scientists didn't report is that the differences themselves were actually very tiny. I won't go into effect size here, you may know what I'm talking about, but it means that where you've got small differences here, statistically they may come out as significant, but the effect is very tiny, hugely overlapping. So what differences you've got there are really not very significant. Similar paper from this lab more recently, sex differences. This is where they're looking at connections, ways in which you can actually map connections. And this is resting state fMRI, so this is like the function of the brain at work or at rest in particular. Linked sex differences in cognition, looking at different networks. And what they actually claim here is that you can't see it very clearly, but there are sex differences in some connections. So they claim this as proof that there are sex differences in the brain. What they don't report is that in order to look at these sort of network connections, you can actually do, and I've got the number here, 34,716 comparisons. What this represents is that the only significant differences this group found, and those are 179. So the statistical people among you will say, if you've done over 34,000 comparisons and you only find 179 differences, how prominent are those differences that you are reporting? So unfortunately, there is problems in the neuroscientist world. And this, in fact, is something I don't need to show because it really touches very much on what Vanessa has shown. We have plastic brains. Our brains can change all the time. Big breakthrough for neuroscience, but something the neuroscientists themselves forget. All we get, sex is not enough. That's referring to the gender of the participant, nothing else. You might get the age as well. So they do these amazing comparisons between big databases and they forget all the other bits of information. And luckily I've only got the one image because somebody I found summarised this really nicely for me. This is a drawing from a 6-year-old who actually points out our brains are attached to the world. So we need to be careful what questions we're asking. We need to be careful how we communicate the answers, and we need to remember that our brains are in the world and just talking about age and sex is not enough. Okay? And that's me. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you.